Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guests today are Aaron Jones and Don Wolfensberger, two experts on Congress. Aaron is Director of Congressional Relations at the Wilson Center. He's also the producer and host of the podcast Need to Know. And Aaron spent 8 years on Capitol Hill in the office of Representative Hal Rogers. Don Wolfensberger is a Wilson Center Congressional Fellow who previously served as director of the Center's Congress Project. During Don's nearly 3 decades on the Hill, he held several positions, including serving as Republican staff director of the Rules Committee. Don is also a fellow with the Bipartisan Policy Center. Gentlemen, welcome. Great to see you under these circumstances. I hope you're both doing well.
Thank you, John. I'm doing very well.
Thank you, John. It's good to see you.
Great. So, I in figuring a jumping off point for our discussion, I couldn't help but go for the cheap joke of Americans tend to be cynical about their government. And so the question might be, is Congress doing any worse than it was before the shutdown, during the shutdown? Aaron, all silliness aside, let's start with you. Generally speaking, how is the institution adapting?
It's been an adjustment for sure. And to your joke there, it's actually interesting. Congress has got a higher approval rating now than it did 10 years ago when the financial crisis hit. So it's actually doing better at a nadir of 9%. I think the last time I saw a polling number, it was about 21%. Still low, but it's higher than it was. So I guess if we just want to do a little bit better each time. But the institution, I think people have to remember, is ultimately a human institution. These are people who have to interact with one another. They meet not just on the floor, but behind closed doors and even in hallways. And not having that interaction, I think, is an adjustment that Congress has to make. And then there is the ultimate adjustment of how do you legislate in this situation? How do you conduct oversight in this situation? How do your staffs communicate with you in this situation? So it's a lot that Congress has had to adjust to.
Don, Aaron mentions interaction, face-to-face interaction, and our old boss, Lee Hamilton, before he left town, I interviewed him about changes he had observed while his long time in D.C., and he said, as far as the Hill went, that he saw the lack of interaction between members was becoming a real weakness for the institution. That was a little while ago. And now we've reached even new heights of that kind of separation.
Yeah, you're so right on that, and Lee is too. And I think one of the reasons is that things are a lot more scripted nowadays with television, especially, which came into being in the House in 1979 and the Senate in '86. But members get up and they do their little script, and they quite often leave the floor. Maybe once in a while there'll be questioned about something, but by another member. But very few colloquies because time is very strictly limited by the managers of a bill, and so that's a part of the problem. I think was just the fact that when things are televised, the members don't want to get too far off script.
About that, since you bring that up, I want to ask, I know you were there when it all happened, Don, and Aaron, you were certainly in Congress or working with Congress during the C-SPAN era. C-SPAN, I've full transparency, I've worked for them and with them. I consider most of the folks that are over there good friends and colleagues. But, C-SPAN has always tried to position itself as non-intervention, the network of record. They bring the cameras in and they try to keep a low profile. But you're suggesting, Don, that cameras change everything, right? That it does change the behavior and it does change the workings of the institution. Can both of you comment on that? We're going to sort of sidetrack to this old technology before we get into remote congressional hearings and some of the other things that are happening during the shutdown. Your thoughts on that, gentlemen?
Well, let me go first on this one. I think we have to go back to actually electronic voting back in the early 70s when members used to be hanging around the floor while the roll was being called about twice orally, and then we got electronic voting, and so members duck in and vote quite often and duck out. So there's not as much commingling with other members as there were before that. And so then television came along about 9 years later. But I think that it's, as I say, members don't want to mess up in public. And when you're on television, they're very careful about what they say. And as I say, they are pretty much scripted. So that's the main difference that I've seen. And I was a big proponent, and still am, of televising. I think the more the people see of their legislature, the better. But at the same time, you got to recognize there are some downsides to it.
Aaron, what did you observe?
I think that there's a lot of people who would agree that cameras are going to change everything. When you cast that kind of spotlight on it, and there's a lot of members that I have talked to and some staff members who had been around for a while that really saw that the Newt Gingrich era in the early 90s really made a lot of use of two factors. One was the C-SPAN cameras, and two were the general order speeches, which were speeches that were conducted after the House had really concluded all of its legislative business for the day. Essentially, these were usually the honorary tributes that people would give, and sometimes political speeches. But in this era, they started to look directly into those cameras and speaking to the American people, even though there may have been a dozen people or less actually within the chamber itself, but really speaking directly into the camera and making that kind of use. I had talked to a lot of people who really say, and they kind of trace some of the real partisan divisions that we see today back to that era where using that technology and that piece of floor time to that sort of political advantage.
Yeah, we saw a
Go ahead,
blow up
please,
of that. Yeah, when Newt Gingrich and Bob Walker and those were the backbenchers that were doing the special orders at the end of the day, and they would be calling out Democrats for having done this or that. And that's when Tip O'Neill decided to change the policy of just only showing the members speaking, and he directed the cameras to show the empty chamber so that they would realize that those Democrats were not there to respond to things that were being said of them.
And they don't call it hardball for nothing, right?
That's
So,
right.
so now this era and new technology being used, finally, we're getting to see the Supreme Court in action as a result of these changes. I know it's early in the game, but do you sense that Congress's behavior is changing in reaction to whether it be the Zoom type technology that we're using today or any of the other remote activities that have been going on in the last couple of weeks?
Go ahead, Aaron.
From what I've seen in some of the hearings that I have watched, I think that the virtual conducting a hearing virtually is difficult for Congress because you do not have as easily an ability to interject when you're conducting a line of questioning. You can see in a live hearing, you may have a witness, they could be hostile, or the member questioning could be hostile, and there could be, I guess, filibustering on either side. There's little opportunity, and it is a little more clumsy in the virtual setting to do that. I think Congress is just going to have to get used to this technology, and I think that they are going to have to find ways really to. They're supposed to be able to conduct markups, and I think that it's going to be interesting to see how they conduct committee votes, committee markups, and do appropriations legislation or the defense authorization bill, how all that's going to work in the committees in this virtual way.
Yeah, and I think we should point out to those that are just new to what's happened within the last week, the House just authorized for the first time official proceedings of committees to be done by, we call it a hybrid markup or hearing or whatever, where some members are here in Washington, but others are back in their districts, but they are able to participate in the proceedings of committees. That's not going to be the case with the House itself, though. They are going to have to do proxy voting, sending in their proxies by email to the clerk, or a designated member, I should say, who would cast their votes on specific issues that the member was aware of coming up.
Don, the types of things you describe, are these functions of tradition or actually hard and fast rules?
No, these rules are last at 45 days at a time, and they can be renewed if the crisis is still on, but they have not adjusted the standing rules of the House to allow for that to happen. I suspect that may happen with respect to committee hearings, but I doubt if that they will continue it after this coronavirus crisis to allow proxies for the House floor votes.
Aaron, do the rules need to change? Are these antiquated rules that don't address the current environment, even without a pandemic?
Well, I mean, Congress does change. I think there's a sense that these are calcified rules and things like that. There is a constitutional argument that Republicans have been putting up that they should be present in the chamber. And there's a sense that if you give this proxy power, then you're essentially giving members who are on the East Coast or east of the Mississippi more power than other members because they can control in some way a certain number of votes. I don't know if that would actually play out that way. I'm just restating some of the arguments that I've heard about it. But I go back to this idea that this is a challenge for Congress because it ultimately is a human institution, and the interaction and interplay of ideas really needs to take place. I agree with Don. There's a lot of things that are scripted nowadays, and I think for somebody who watches it for over decades, they would say, that this has gone downhill. From what I've seen, there's still a lot of interaction behind closed doors, and there's still a lot of appetite for interaction. We at the Wilson Center have staff programs, foreign policy program, an AI program, and cyber program that brings staffers together. There's a lot of appetite for that. I was talking to a staffer today who was questioning me about the program. There's, even in this situation, there's an appetite for that kind of interaction. And I think that it's an adjustment. And the constitutional issues, I think, are going to keep being raised, and the questions, and it could even end up going to the courts to see if this is something that they should keep doing. And then ultimately, next year, there'll be a new Congress sworn in, and they'll have to deal with it then, and there'll be an opportunity for them to change their rules at the beginning of the next Congress.
Don, was there a rules change during your time with the committee that would sort of give us some insight into the process and how it might apply today?
With which committee you're talking about?
When the Rules Committee, when you were with the Rules Committee, were there, your sense of, is this something that comes easily to the body when it's time to make a move, or is this glacial in the way that things proceed?
I think I would say Congress evolves, I wouldn't say glacially necessarily, but in response to necessities that arise and so on. So Congress can be very flexible. They can move quickly when there's a need to, but otherwise you've seen how things have slowly evolved over the last half century, I would say. And that's, it's been a very interesting process to watch. But, if you have a change in party control, well, then you'll see some more innovations coming in. And when the Democrats lost power, the Republicans came in and they had a whole raft of new rules changes that they'd been talking about for decades. And all of a sudden, after 40 years, here they are out of the wilderness and in power. And so they did make some changes at that time. That was in 1995.
Is this just the pendulum swinging back and forth and depends who's in power, or is there bipartisanship when it comes to rule changes?
I think there's some bipartisanship. I think quite often a lot of Democrats, staff, and members had mentioned to me and my bosses that we're glad that you did what you did in 95, because in a lot of instances it was an improvement for the institution. In other instances, they changed them back when the Democrats took power again. But one example that they had kept up until now was the idea of proxy voting in committees. Republicans got rid of that in 95, and the Democrats have been in power now. Well, this is the third time around this past year, but they have kept the ban on proxy voting in committees.
If I could jump in here, John, I think
Of course.
it's also important to recognize there are changes, like Don says, they evolve over time, but then they become stuck in the American memory as if they've always been around. And what jumps to mind is the August recess, right? The August recess is not something that's always been around. In fact, Congress used to be in town a whole lot less. And then modern inventions such as air conditioning, electricity, throughout the early and mid 20th century started keeping Congress in a lot longer. And essentially they were starting to have year-round sessions until in the late 1960s, the members said, well, we got to do something about this, and instituted the August recess. So we kind of think of the August recess as something that's, you can't touch that, but it's something that it really is only about 50 years old. And so, there are things that have to adjust, and that Congress does adjust over time. And I think we just forget about them as time goes on quickly.
You forgot to mention.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
you
forgot to mention jet aircraft. I mean, the fact that members now can go back to their districts about every weekend and then come back the following Monday. That's why they like the idea of Monday to Thursday or Tuesday to Thursday and then 3-day weekends. But it used to be, before jet aircraft, that members had their families here in Washington, and there was a lot more mixing between the parties when the families got together for picnics and so on. But now, a member is out the door after the last vote on a Thursday, and you'll see them, at the first vote on Monday, probably coming back.
Necessity as the mother of invention. All of us have been engaged in discussions about what are the changes that we're experiencing during this lockdown that will be lasting, or at least that have opened the door to new ways of doing business. I'm going to ask both of you to look ahead and think about what might be lasting changes in the way Congress conducts its business. And you can both give us your predictions in that regard, but also your suggestions. Do you see any opportunities to make changes that would be useful to the operation of the institution? Aaron, let's begin with you, and then we'll give Don the final word.
Yeah, I think we're still going to have to watch and see how this plays out. I think there is a temptation to think that this could be the camel's nose under the tent for doing more proxy voting, more virtual stuff. I think that the biggest thing is whether or not we have to go back into further lockdowns, and if we are going to see more pandemics. I mean, one of the reasons why in the 1800s, besides the heat and humidity of Washington, D.C., that Congress would leave every spring and then come back in the fall was because they were worried about plague. So
malaria and yeah,
exactly. And so if that is something that we're going back to, and some scientists say that as we push further into animal habitats and with climate change, that this could be something we deal with a lot more. Well, it's a reality Congress is going to have to deal with, maybe sooner than 50 years from now. So what I actually wrote a piece in the Hill that looked at this and what this is going to do if Congress has to stay home more often, if they're back in their districts more often. What does that do to the policy apparatus that has been set up in Washington, D.C.? Think tanks like the Wilson Center and lobbying shops and the media that is set up here. And all of those things have really been geared towards a Congress that is in Washington about 10 months out of the year. And we, are used to picking up the phone and talking to congressional staffers who are residing in one of the office buildings on either side of the Capitol. And if they end up being home more often, you're going to see more of the district staff taking on policy roles and being next to the member of Congress. And how does the Washington policy apparatus adjust to that?
Yeah, I've got the camel's nose under the tent is a very fit metaphor. I have the worry that, and I've sort of come up with two rules. One is that today's convenience becomes tomorrow's necessity. And secondly, necessity and expediency are anathema to deliberation. And that's the biggest worry I have. Let's say that this plague, this pandemic passes, but members still like the idea, hey, if I'm really sick or I'm tending to a family member, why shouldn't I continue to be able to vote by proxy for my home district? And the more and more, if that catches on, I think you're just going to lose more and more possibilities for good deliberation, which is, I think, essential to the lawmaking process.
Well, gentlemen, we'll leave it there and we'll revisit this. And I just want to let our viewers and listeners know that if you're interested in the U.S. Congress, the two gentlemen on your screens and in your ears today are tremendous resources. They really not only understand the current operations of the U.S. Congress, but also have a great sense of its history and are both students of the U.S. Congress. You can catch up with Aaron on his Need to Know podcast. That's a great place. And Don has a regular column in the Hill where he writes about Congress. So, gentlemen, thanks for being with us today. Continued good health to you and your families, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
And to those of you joining us, thank you for joining us for this edition of Wilson Center Now. Hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back with more. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.